"Can I have your leftovers, sir?" the little homeless girl whispered, pointing at the untouched steak on the billionaire mafia boss's table. The entire restaurant fell silent as wealthy diners turned to stare at the barefoot child in torn clothes. Security rushed toward her, ready to drag her outside, until the billionaire raised his eyes and spoke 6 chilling words.
Lay a finger on her, and you lose them.
No one moved. Something about the little girl's eyes made his heart ache, in a way he couldn't explain. He had no idea the hungry child begging for scraps wasn't a stranger at all. She was the daughter he believed had died alongside his wife 7 years earlier, or so he believed. Want to see how a single plate of leftovers reunited a grieving billionaire with the daughter he thought was dead? Then stay until the very end, because this unbelievable story will leave you speechless. Faith Kumelo stood outside the glass door of the restaurant for a long time before she pushed it open. Warm air hit her face, and she smelled meat cooking somewhere behind the counter, and her stomach turned on itself so hard she almost bent over. Nobody stopped her at the door. Nobody looked at her long enough to stop her. Inside, the restaurant was quiet and expensive. Candles burned low on every table. Waiters moved between the tables without making noise, the way people move when they have been trained to disappear into a room. Faith walked slowly past the tables, her sack bag pressed against her side, her eyes scanning every plate for food that was about to be thrown away. She found him near the back, sitting alone. His suit was dark and fit him without a single wrinkle. He was not eating anymore. He was staring past his plate at nothing, the way tired grown men do when their minds are somewhere else entirely. A waitress was already walking toward his table with her hand out to take the plate, and there was still food on it. Rice and meat that nobody had touched in the last few minutes. Faith's feet moved before her mind agreed to it. "Can I have your leftovers, sir?" she said, pointing at the plate. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. "If you are done with it." The man turned his head. His eyes found her, a small girl standing too close to his table, her clothes thin, her hair pulled back with a rubber band that had lost its stretch. For 1 second, nobody at the table moved. Faith's courage left her as fast as it had come. "Never mind," she said quickly, stepping back. "I did not mean to bother you. I will go." "Wait." The word stopped her feet cold. She turned back, unsure if she was in trouble. "I never said you were bothering me, child," he said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the space between them completely. He was not smiling, but there was something in his face that had not been there a second before he saw her. Something soft, aching, almost afraid. Before Faith could answer, the restaurant manager appeared beside the table like he had been summoned by an alarm only he could hear. He was a thin man in a black vest, and his face had already decided what kind of girl Faith was before he said a single word. "I am so sorry, sir," the manager said, reaching for Faith's shoulder. "Security will remove her right away. She should not even be inside." His hand had not yet touched her. The man at the table did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Lay a finger on her, and you lose them," he said. The words landed on the room like a dropped plate. A glass somewhere behind Faith slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the floor. A woman 2 tables away whispered something to her husband and covered her mouth. The manager's hand froze in the air, then slowly pulled back, as if it had touched something hot. Nobody in the restaurant moved for what felt like a long time. "Sit," the man said to Faith, nodding at the empty chair across from him. Faith sat down slowly, her heart still slamming against her ribs from the shock of what she had just heard. He looked at the manager, who was still standing there, pale and frozen. "Bring her the best portion of the pork belly, rice and d'oeuvre, whatever else she wants." The manager blinked, as if he had misheard. "Sir, for her," he asked, his tone sliding toward something close to disgust. The man did not repeat himself. He simply looked at the manager until the manager understood that the question had already been answered, and the manager turned and walked away fast, disappearing through the kitchen doors. Faith stared at the table, unsure if this was real or if she had fallen asleep somewhere on the street and dreamed the whole thing. The food arrived faster than she expected. A full plate, steaming, more meat than she had seen in one place in longer than she could remember. She did not wait. She did not think about manners. She ate like the food might vanish if she looked away from it for even a second, shoveling rice into her mouth, barely chewing before swallowing. The man across from her let out a small laugh, surprised out of him before he could stop it. "Slow down," he said gently. "Nobody is taking it from you." Faith looked up at him with her cheeks full, and for the first time since walking through the door, she managed something close to a smile. "Thank you," she said, her mouth still half full. She said it again a moment later, and then again after that, the words slipping out of her like a habit she could not turn off, as if gratitude was the only currency she had ever been allowed to spend. He watched her eat in silence for a while, his own meal forgotten in front of him. There was something about the way she held her fork, careful, like she had been taught manners once by someone who loved her, that made his throat tighten in a way he did not want to examine too closely. "Tell me your story," he said finally. "Where do you live? Where are your parents?" Faith's fork slowed against her plate. "I do not have anyone," she said simply, without drama, the way a person says a fact they have said many times before. "I have been looking for my parents. I do not know where they are. I do not even know if they are looking for me." The man went very still. Something about the way she said it, flat, tired, too old for a child her age, reminded him of a face he had spent years trying to stop seeing when he closed his eyes. He told himself it was nothing. Grief did strange things to a man's mind. It made strangers look like ghosts if you let it. He could not look away from her. "Finish your food," he said quietly, because he did not trust his voice to say anything else just yet. That night, long after Faith had eaten more food than she had eaten in weeks, the man sat in the back of a car with her beside him, watching the city lights slide past the window. He had not planned any of this. An hour ago he had been a man finishing a lonely meal, waiting for his driver to take him home to an empty house and a fiancée he did not love. Now there was a child asleep against the door, her small body finally warm, her breathing even for the first time all day. His name was Yeon-woo Chang, and by morning nothing about his life would be simple again. He did not take her home that first night out of pity alone. He told himself it was temporary, a kindness, the kind of thing a decent man does and forgets about by the following week. He arranged a room for her in the east wing of his house, far from his own quarters, close enough to the kitchen that the staff could check on her without disturbing anyone. Faith woke up the next morning in a bed so soft she thought she might sink into it and disappear. For a long moment she lay still, afraid that moving would break whatever spell had brought her here. Sunlight came through the curtains in a way it never had through the plastic sheeting she used to sleep under near the train station. A woman knocked gently on her door before opening it. She was tall, with skin the color of Faith's own, her hair wrapped in a bright cloth that caught the morning light. Her name, she said, was Amara, and she had worked in this house longer than most of the furniture had existed. "You must be the one everyone in the kitchen is whispering about," Amara said, smiling as she set down a tray of food. "Eat slowly. There is more where that came from." Faith stared at her, unable to remember the last time a grown woman had smiled at her like that, without wanting something in return. Days turned into a routine faster than Faith expected. Yeon-woo did not visit her often at first, sending instructions through Amara instead, arranging for doctors to check her over, for a tailor to bring clothes that actually fit her small frame. But every evening, without fail, he would appear briefly at her door, standing awkwardly in the frame, like a man who did not know the rules of the room he was in. "Do you need anything?" he would ask, every night, the same 4 words. "No," Faith would answer, every night, until one evening she added, quietly, "Thank you for not throwing me out." Yeon-woo did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing and simply nodded before closing the door behind him. The following week, Yeon-woo took her to a school that turned away children for smaller reasons than the ones written across Faith's short life. He walked into the principal's office with Faith trailing behind him, and within minutes the woman behind the desk had gone from stiff politeness to eager cooperation, her objections folding one by one under the weight of his name and the checks his assistant was already preparing. "She will need uniforms," the principal said finally, flipping through papers she had not read closely enough to argue with anymore. And records. Does she have records? She has me, Yeonwoo said simply, and that answer, somehow, was enough. Faith sat in the hallway outside the office, swinging her legs from a chair too tall for her, listening to the murmur of adult voices, deciding her future without asking her opinion on any of it. She did not mind. For the first time in longer than she could measure, her future was being decided by someone who was not trying to take something from her. That afternoon, Yeonwoo took her shopping, though he called it running errands, as if buying a child new shoes was a task on the same level as signing contracts. Faith stood in front of racks of clothes she had never imagined wearing, unsure how to choose anything, unused to the idea that choosing was even something she was allowed to do. "Pick what you like," he said, standing a few steps back, hands in his pockets. "I do not know what I like," Faith admitted, her fingers hovering over a soft yellow sweater without touching it. Something in his chest twisted at that sentence. He picked up the yellow sweater himself and placed it in her hands. "Then we will find out together," he said. On her first morning at school, Faith stood in front of the mirror in her new uniform, tugging at the collar like it might strangle her if she stopped watching it. She had never worn a uniform that matched anyone else's before. She had never belonged to a group of children who all looked the same on purpose. Amara fixed the collar for her without being asked, smoothing down a stray piece of hair near Faith's ear. "You look like every other child in that school now," Amara said. "Nobody will know where you came from unless you tell them." Faith stared at her own reflection for a long moment. "What if they ask?" "Then you tell them what you want them to know," Amara said. "Not everything has to be shared just because someone asks for it." The car ride to school felt longer than it should have. Faith sat with her hands pressed flat against her knees, watching the buildings slide past the window, saying nothing. Yeonwoo, sitting beside her, noticed her silence and did not fill it with empty comfort. He simply let her be afraid, without rushing her out of it. "If it goes badly," he said finally, as the car slowed outside the gate, "you come home, and tomorrow we try again. That is all." Faith looked at him, surprised that failure had already been given permission before she had even walked through the door. The classroom swallowed her the moment she stepped inside. 30 faces turned toward her, and for a second, Faith felt smaller than she had felt standing outside the restaurant weeks earlier. A girl near the window whispered something to her neighbor, and Faith's stomach folded in on itself, bracing for the kind of cruelty she already knew how to survive. But the boy sitting closest to the empty seat only slid his chair sideways to make room and said, "You can sit here if you want," without asking anything else, without needing anything else. And Faith sat down beside him, feeling something unclench slightly in her chest. By the end of the day, she had a name to remember, a small drawing folded into her pocket that a girl named Somi had given her without explanation, and a quiet, cautious feeling that maybe this place would not spit her back out the way every other place in her life had. Somi found her again during lunch, sliding onto the bench across from Faith, without asking permission, the way children do when they have already decided someone is worth knowing. "You do not talk much," Somi said, unwrapping her food. "I am still deciding if this is real," Faith admitted. Somi laughed, not unkindly. "You talk like someone in a drama." "I have never watched a drama," Faith said. Somi's eyes widened like Faith had confessed to a crime. "Then you have never truly lived," she said, and spent the rest of lunch describing entire plots from memory, gesturing with her chopsticks, while Faith listened and laughed for the first time that day at something that had nothing to do with survival at all. By the time the bell rang, Faith had agreed to come to Somi's house one weekend to watch an episode, and walked back to class feeling, for a few unguarded minutes, like an ordinary child with an ordinary friend, and nothing chasing her at all. That same week, an envelope arrived at the house addressed to Faith directly, which was strange enough on its own that Amara carried it to her with both hands, turning it over twice before handing it across. Inside was a short, careful note from the restaurant manager, who had once tried to have her removed by security. He wrote that he had been ashamed of himself since that night, that he had not stopped thinking about the way he judged a hungry child before knowing anything about her, and that he hoped she would accept a standing invitation to eat at his restaurant any time she liked, free of charge, for as long as he worked there. Faith read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer beside her bed, next to the yellow sweater she had chosen on her first shopping trip. "Are you going to forgive him?" Amara asked, watching her fold the paper. "I already did," Faith said simply. "It is easier to forgive people once you are not hungry anymore." Amara said nothing to that, but something in her chest ached at the simple honesty of it, the way only a child who had known real hunger could explain forgiveness so plainly. Later that same day, they stopped for ice cream at a small shop near the river, the kind of ordinary outing Yeon-woo had not allowed himself in years. Faith sat across from him, licking a chocolate cone slowly, savoring it the way she savored everything now, like it might be the last of its kind. "You laugh strange," she told him suddenly, watching him chuckle at something small she had said. "Strange how?" he asked, amused. "Like you forgot how to do it and you are still practicing," Faith said, without any meanness in her voice, only observation. Yeon-woo stared at her for a long moment, caught between wanting to defend himself and wanting to admit she was right. In the end, he said nothing, only laughed again, softer this time, and Faith smiled at her ice cream like she had won something. Back at the house that evening, Amara found Faith sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor while she cooked, peeling small vegetables with more focus than the task required. "You are settling in," Amara said, glancing down at her. "I do not want to get used to it," Faith admitted quietly, not looking up. "In case it does not last." Amara paused her chopping. She crouched down until she was eye level with the girl. "Some things last longer than you think, child. Not everything good disappears." Faith did not answer, but she leaned slightly closer to Amara's side as she kept peeling, and neither of them mentioned it again. Yeon-woo watched this from the hallway without either of them noticing him there. He watched the woman who had raised half his household staff's children fold this stranger's daughter into her care as if it cost her nothing, and he felt, for the first time in 7 years, something loosen behind his ribs. He did not yet understand why looking at Faith felt like looking at something he had lost. He only knew that every time she laughed, some old wound in him ached in a way that was almost pleasant, almost dangerous, almost like hope trying to force its way back into a body that had trained itself to live without it. The peace did not last long. Aryam arrived at the house 3 days later, unannounced, her heels clicking against the marble floor before anyone could warn Yeon-woo she was coming. She found Faith in the living room, sprawled on the floor with crayons scattered around her, drawing something with careful, focused strokes. Aryam stopped in the doorway, her expression sliding from confusion into something colder within seconds. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice pleasant on the surface, sharp underneath it. "A guest," Yeon-woo said, stepping into the room behind her. "She will be staying with us for a while." Aryam's eyes moved from Faith to Yeon-woo and back again, calculating something neither of them could see. "For a while," she repeated slowly. "How long is a while?" Yeon-woo did not answer immediately, and that silence told Aryam everything she needed to know. That night, after Faith had gone to bed, Aryam found Yeon-woo in his study, standing near the window with a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. "You cannot keep a stray child in this house and expect no questions," she said, closing the door behind her. "People will talk. My family will ask why a homeless girl is living under your roof while our wedding is still being planned." "She is not a stray," Yeon-woo said quietly, not turning around. "Then what is she?" Aryam asked. He did not have an answer for that, not one he was ready to say out loud, not even to himself. He only knew that something about the shape of Faith's face when she slept reminded him of a photograph he kept locked in a drawer he had not opened in years, and he was not ready to explain that ache to a woman who had never once asked him about his grief. Aryam studied his silence carefully, filing it away like a piece of information she would use later. "Fine," she said finally, her voice smooth again, though something behind her eyes had hardened. "Keep your little charity project. Just make sure it does not become a problem." She left the room without waiting for his response, and Yeonwoo stood alone by the window for a long time after, staring out at the dark garden below, unable to explain even to himself why the thought of Faith leaving this house now felt heavier than anything Ariam had ever said to him. Ariam did not go straight to bed that night. She sat in her own car outside the gate, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in a low voice to someone on the other end who called her by a family name she rarely used inside Yeonwoo's house. "There is a child living with him now," she said. "No, not his. Some street orphan he picked up out of pity." The voice on the other end asked a question. Ariam answered with more irritation than she intended to show. "I do not know why it bothers me," she admitted. "It should not matter, but he has not looked at me the way he looks at that girl in weeks, and I did not agree to marry a man who forgets I exist the moment something small and pitiful walks into a room." She listened for a long moment to whatever was said back to her, then straightened in her seat, her expression sharpening into something colder and more focused. "Watch her," she said finally, quietly. "I want to know everything about where she came from, before this goes any further." She ended the call and sat alone in the dark for several minutes before finally driving away, already turning the shape of a plan over in her mind, one she was not ready to share with anyone just yet. Dr. Park had known Yeonwoo since before either of them had grey hair to speak of. He had been the one standing on the dock 7 years earlier when the search boats came back empty for the second night in a row, the one who had held a weeping young husband upright when the first small body was pulled from the water and placed gently on the sand. He had signed the papers that closed that case. He had never fully forgiven himself for how quickly he had done it. So when Faith Kumelo's blood work came back with numbers that should not have been possible by simple chance, something old and unfinished stirred awake inside him, a question he had buried alongside a family he had failed to save in time. He told himself it was foolish. Grief made old men see ghosts in strangers all the time. But foolish or not, he could not put the file down that night, and he could not stop his hands from reaching for a second test he had not yet told anyone he intended to run. Weeks passed, and Faith began to change in small, quiet ways nobody announced out loud. She stopped flinching when doors opened suddenly. She stopped hiding food in her sleeves at dinner, though it took Amara gently unpacking the habit from her one bite at a time. She started asking questions about the house, about the garden, about the framed photograph on the hallway wall of a woman with kind eyes standing beside a much younger Yeonwoo. "Who is that?" Faith asked one afternoon, stopping in front of the photograph on her way to the kitchen. Yeonwoo, passing through the hallway at the same moment, stopped beside her. "My wife," he said simply. "She died a long time ago." Faith looked at the photograph for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "So am I," Yeonwoo answered, and for a moment the two of them stood side by side in the hallway, staring at a woman neither of them could bring back, sharing a grief that neither of them yet understood they had more in common with than either could imagine. That night, Faith woke up screaming. Amara reached her room first, flicking on the light to find Faith tangled in her sheets, soaked in sweat, her small hands clawing at the blanket like she was trying to push something off her chest. "I could not breathe," Faith gasped, her eyes wide and unfocused. There was water everywhere. "I could not find the light." Amara gathered her into her arms, rocking her gently, murmuring words in a language Faith did not fully understand, but somehow found comforting anyway. Yeonwoo appeared in the doorway moments later, drawn by the sound of Faith's screaming, his face pale in the low light of the hallway. "She has these sometimes," Amara said quietly over Faith's shaking shoulders. "Dreams about water. She has never told me why." Yeonwoo stood frozen in the doorway, watching the girl shake in Amara's arms, a strange, cold feeling crawling up the back of his neck that he could not name and did not want to examine. He told himself it meant nothing. Children had nightmares. It was not unusual. But long after Amara had settled Faith back to sleep and the house had gone quiet again, Yeonwoo did not return to his own bed. He walked instead to his study, locked the door behind him, though there was no one left awake to disturb him, and knelt in front of the bottom drawer of his desk, the one he had not opened in over a year. Inside lay a single photograph, its edges soft with handling, of a woman laughing at something outside the frame, a baby wrapped in a pale blanket resting against her shoulder. He had looked at this photograph so many times in the first year after the accident that he had eventually forced himself to stop, afraid of what staring at a dead woman's smile every night was doing to the rest of him. He held it now under the lamplight, studying the baby's face as if it could somehow tell him something it had never been old enough to say. He searched for a resemblance he was too afraid to name out loud, comparing a memory of an infant he had known for only a few months to the sleeping, shaking child down the hallway who screamed about drowning in a language of fear she should not have been old enough to remember. It was impossible, he told himself. His daughter was gone. He had stood over the small stone himself. He had chosen the flowers, and yet his hands would not stop trembling as he placed the photograph back in the drawer, and he did not sleep that night, not for even a single hour. The following week, Faith complained of a headache during breakfast, pressing her small hand against her temple as she pushed her rice around her plate without eating it. Amara noticed first, feeling her forehead and frowning at the heat radiating off the girl's skin. "You are burning up," Amara said, already reaching for the house phone. "I am calling the doctor." Faith tried to insist she was fine, that it was nothing, that she did not want to be a bother, the same words she had used the very first night she asked for leftovers in a restaurant that had almost thrown her out into the cold. Nobody in the house believed her this time. By the time the doctor arrived that afternoon, Faith's fever had climbed high enough to worry even Yeon-woo, who cancelled every meeting on his calendar without explanation and stood in the hallway outside her room, listening to the doctor's careful, measured questions through the door. The doctor who arrived was an old man named Dr. Park, a friend of Yeon-woo's family for longer than Faith had been alive. A man who had once tried and failed to save a woman and her baby from drowning in a storm nobody could have predicted. He examined Faith with the practiced calm of someone who had seen 100 fevers before, but something about her blood work, once it came back later that evening, made his hands go very still over the paper. He did not say anything to Yeon-woo that night. He only asked, quietly, if he could run one more test, just to be certain, and Yeon-woo, too worried about the fever itself to think much of the request, agreed without asking why. 2 days later, Faith's fever broke, but her body did not fully recover the way it should have. She grew tired faster than before, her skin paler under the brown, small bruises appearing on her arms that nobody could explain. Dr. Park returned to the house more often than usual, running blood work each time with an urgency that made Amara nervous, and Yeon-woo increasingly desperate for answers nobody seemed ready to give him. "What is happening to her?" Yeon-woo demanded one evening, cornering the doctor in the hallway after another round of tests. Dr. Park hesitated, his old eyes heavy with something he was not yet ready to explain. "I need one more test," he said quietly. "After that, I will tell you everything. I promise you that." Yeon-woo wanted to argue, to demand answers immediately, but something in the old doctor's face stopped him. He nodded instead, though the fear sitting in his stomach only grew heavier with every hour that passed without answers. 3 nights later, the fever returned, worse than before, and this time it did not break on its own. Faith collapsed in the middle of the school hallway during morning assembly, her body folding to the floor before any teacher could reach her, her small frame shaking as the world around her blurred into sound without shape. A teacher screamed for help, another child ran for the office. By the time the ambulance arrived, Faith's lips had turned a color no child's lips should ever turn, and the paramedics were shouting numbers to each other that meant nothing to the terrified students watching from the hallway doors. At his office across the city, Yeon-woo's phone rang once, twice, 3 times before his assistant finally picked it up and heard the words that made her drop the receiver and run straight into his meeting without knocking first. "Sir," she said, breathless, her face white. "It is the school. Something is wrong with Faith." Yeon-woo was out of the building before she finished the sentence. He did not remember the drive to the hospital. He did not remember running through the doors, past nurses who tried to stop him, past a security guard who took one look at his face and stepped aside without a word. He only remembered reaching the emergency room doors and finding Dr. Park standing there, his face grim, holding a folder Yeon-woo had not seen before. "She needs a transfusion," Dr. Park said quickly, before Yeon-woo could ask anything. "Her blood type is rare. We are running compatibility tests on everyone available right now." "Test me," Yeon-woo said immediately, rolling up his sleeve before the doctor could even ask. "Test me first." Dr. Park stared at him for a long moment, something complicated passing behind his eyes, before he nodded and called for a nurse. The results came back faster than either of them expected. A match. Not a coincidence anyone could explain easily. Not a common blood type shared by half the population. A match rare enough that Dr. Park's hands shook slightly as he read the numbers on the page. Rare enough that he found himself staring at Yeon-woo across the small, sterile room with a question forming in his chest that he was almost afraid to ask out loud. "There is something else," Dr. Park said slowly, choosing his words with the care of a man walking across thin ice. "I would like to run one more test, not for her blood type, for something else entirely." Yeon-woo, still catching his breath from the run through the hospital corridors, frowned at him. "What kind of test?" Dr. Park hesitated, glancing once toward the closed door of the room where Faith lay hooked to machines that beeped steadily, too steadily, like the room itself was holding its breath. "A paternity test," he said finally. "I need to know something, and I think you do too, even if you have not let yourself ask it yet." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Yeon-woo could not breathe at all, could not move, could not do anything except stare at the old doctor's face and feel the ground shift beneath a version of his life he thought he had already buried 7 years ago, beside a small grave with his daughter's name carved into the stone. "Run it," Yeon-woo said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Park nodded once and disappeared through the door, leaving Yeon-woo alone in the hallway with nothing but the sound of the machines behind the glass and a question he was terrified to answer, standing at the edge of a truth that was about to break his entire world open in ways he could not yet imagine. The transfusion worked before the paternity test even began. Faith's color returned within the hour, her breathing steadying under the machines, her small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that finally matched what the monitors wanted to see. Yeon-woo sat beside her bed with his sleeve still rolled up, a cotton ball taped over the crook of his arm, watching her sleep like she might stop breathing again the moment he blinked. Dr. Park did not come back for almost 2 hours. When he finally did, he closed the door quietly behind him and did not sit down. Yeon-woo read the shape of bad news in the old man's shoulders before a single word left his mouth. "It came back negative," Dr. Park said. The words landed somewhere behind Yeon-woo's ribs and stayed there, heavy and useless. He had told himself all afternoon that he was not hoping for anything. He had told himself the blood match was only a coincidence, rare but explainable, the kind of thing statisticians wrote papers about without meaning anything at all. He had told himself so many times that by the time the answer came, he almost believed his own lie. Almost. "Thank you for checking," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt, steady the way a cracked plate looks fine until someone finally picks it up. Dr. Park did not leave. He stood by the door, turning his own hands over like he was reading something written on his palms. "Something is not right," he said finally. "I have run tests for 30 years. I know what handled samples look like. This result does not sit well with me." Yeon-woo looked up at him. "What are you saying?" "I am saying I would like to run it again," Dr. Park said. "Through a lab I trust personally, not the one attached to this hospital. It will take a few days. I am asking you to wait before you decide anything is finished." Yeon-woo did not answer right away. He looked instead at Faith, asleep with a tube taped gently to the back of her hand, her chest rising and falling in the shallow rhythm of a child who had almost stopped breathing that same morning. "Run it," he said quietly. "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes." Dr. Park nodded once and left the room, and Yeon-woo sat back down beside the bed, reaching for Faith's small hand without waking her, holding it the way a man holds something he is terrified to lose twice. The next morning, before visiting hours officially began, a nurse named Hannah slipped quietly into the hospital's sample storage room, using a key card that did not belong to her. She had been given careful instructions 3 days earlier, a photograph of a specific vial, a specific label, and an amount of money that made the risk feel smaller than it actually was. She did not know whose blood she was replacing. She had been told only that a wealthy family wanted a private matter handled quietly, and that questions were not part of the arrangement. She swapped the label on one sample for another she had been given in a sealed envelope, resealed the storage drawer, and walked out of the room as calmly as she had walked in, her heart hammering the entire way to the elevator. She did not know the name Ariam. She only knew the voice on the phone that had promised her enough money to cover a semester of tuition for her younger brother, and she had not asked a single question beyond that. Ariam herself sat in her car outside the hospital that same morning, watching the entrance through the tinted glass, waiting for confirmation that the swap had gone smoothly. When the message finally came through on a phone she used only for matters like this one, she allowed herself a small, private smile before deleting the message entirely. She had not planned to hurt anyone. She told herself that every time doubt crept in, she had only wanted to protect what she had spent 3 years building, an engagement, an alliance, a future that a hungry street child threatened to unravel with nothing more than the accident of shared blood. If the test came back negative, the girl would remain what she had always been to Ariam, a stray kindness, temporary, forgettable, easy to remove from the house once the novelty wore off. She did not yet know that Dr. Park's instincts were older and sharper than any test she could manipulate. 2 days passed in the hospital like slow water. Faith grew stronger with each hour, sitting up on her own, asking for food the moment the smell of the hospital cafeteria drifted down the hallway, complaining about the itch of the tape on her hand, until Amara finally distracted her with stories about the kitchen staff's ongoing feud over whose stew recipe was better. Yeon-woo barely left the building. He held meetings through his phone from the hallway outside her room, signing documents balanced on his knee, his mind splitting itself constantly between the numbers on the page and the sound of Faith's laughter drifting from behind the door whenever Amara said something foolish enough to earn it. "You should go home and sleep in an actual bed," Amara told him on the second evening, finding him slumped in the hallway chair with his tie loosened and his eyes rimmed red from exhaustion. "I am fine here," Yeon-woo said, not opening his eyes. Amara studied him for a long moment. "This is not only about the fever anymore, is it?" Yeon-woo did not answer, and Amara did not push him further, though the knowing look she gave him before walking away told him she had already guessed more than he had said out loud to anyone. Somi visited that same afternoon, arriving with her mother and a small stack of comic books she insisted Faith needed for her recovery, though she spent most of the visit talking instead of letting Faith read a single page. "Everyone at school is asking about you," Somi said, perched on the edge of the hospital bed. "The teacher would not tell us anything, which only made everyone make up worse stories. One boy said you fainted because you saw a ghost." Faith laughed, the sound rough from disuse. "I did not see a ghost. I told them that," Somi said proudly. "I told them you probably just forgot to eat breakfast, because you always eat too fast, like you are worried it will disappear." Faith's smile faltered slightly at that, the observation landing closer to old wounds than Somi could have known, but she did not correct her, only nodded and let the moment pass. Amara watched the two girls from the doorway, arms crossed, something warm settling behind her eyes at the ease between them, the easy give and take of a friendship that had grown without either child needing to explain their whole history to earn it. "You should rest before visiting hours end," Amara said gently, once Somi's mother finally stood to leave. Faith reached out and squeezed Somi's hand before she left, an unspoken promise passing between them that neither girl needed words to complete. On the third morning, Dr. Park returned to the hospital carrying a folder he held against his chest like it weighed more than paper should. He found Yeon-woo exactly where he had left him, in the same hallway chair, waiting. The independent lab flagged something. Dr. Park said, sitting down slowly beside him. The sample I sent for the first test does not match Faith's other blood work from the same week. Different markers entirely. It was never her blood in that first test. Yeonwoo sat up straight, his exhaustion falling away all at once. What does that mean? It means someone replaced the sample before it reached processing, Dr. Park said, which means the first result was never real. I have already collected a new sample myself, personally, and sent it through a courier I trust with my own hands. We will have the true answer within a day. Yeonwoo's mind raced through every person who had access to that storage room, every name that had touched Faith's file since the morning she collapsed, and one name surfaced faster and colder than the rest. He did not say it out loud yet. He was not ready to believe it, not without proof, not about a woman he had planned to marry. Dr. Park spent that same evening quietly reviewing the hospital's own security logs, a task he had no official authority to request, but managed anyway through decades of favors owed to him by people who remembered when he had once saved their own children's lives without asking for anything in return. The footage showed a nurse he did not recognize entering the storage room at an hour when she had no scheduled shift, staying inside for less than 2 minutes before leaving again with nothing visible in her hands. He printed a single still frame from the footage and carried it home with him that night, studying the nurse's face under his reading lamp until he had memorized every detail of it, determined to find her before anyone else in the hospital thought to ask the same questions he was already asking. It took him one more day to match the face to a name, and one more phone call, gentle but firm, to convince the young nurse that confessing quietly to him was a far better choice than waiting for the hospital administration to discover the security footage on their own. Hannah broke down within minutes of his call, admitting everything through tears, insisting over and over that she had not known whose sample she was tampering with, that she had needed the money desperately, that she had told herself it was a small, harmless favor for a family with more resources than sense. Dr. Park did not raise his voice at her once. He simply asked her to write down everything she remembered, every detail of the arrangement, every name she could recall from the brief, careful conversation that had convinced her to risk her entire career for a payment she now deeply regretted accepting. The next 24 hours passed slower than any Yeonwoo had lived through since the week his wife's boat failed to return to shore. He sat with Faith while she practiced writing her own name in a notebook Somi had brought her, the letters careful and slightly crooked, and he watched her tongue poke out of the corner of her mouth in concentration, and he thought, not for the first time, that he had seen that exact expression somewhere before, long before this hospital room, long before any of this had begun. "Do you want to see something?" Faith asked him suddenly, closing the notebook. "Of course," Yeonwoo said. She pulled a folded piece of paper from under her pillow, worn soft at the creases from being carried for a long time. It was a drawing, done in a child's careless crayon lines, of a woman with long hair standing beside water, holding a baby wrapped in a blanket. "I do not know why I draw her," Faith admitted, staring at the paper. "I do not remember her face. I just remember that she was there once. In the water. I think she was trying to hold on to me." Yeonwoo's hands went cold around the edges of the notebook in his lap. "Do you dream about her?" he asked carefully. Faith nodded, not looking up. "Sometimes. I never see her face clearly. I just feel her arms, and then I feel the water slowly pulling the two of us apart from each other." Yeonwoo did not trust himself to speak for a long moment. He reached out instead and smoothed down a piece of Faith's hair that had come loose from its band, his hand trembling slightly in a way he hoped she would not notice. "Keep the drawing safe," he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "Do not lose it." "I never lose the things that matter," Faith said simply, tucking the paper back under her pillow, and Yeonwoo had to look away toward the window for a moment before his composure slipped entirely. The results arrived the following afternoon while Faith was asleep, delivered personally by a courier Dr. Park had waited for outside the hospital entrance himself, refusing to let the envelope pass through a single other hand. He read it alone first, standing in the stairwell where no one could see his face, and when he finally stepped back into the hallway, his eyes were wet in a way Yeon-woo had never seen on the old man in 30 years of friendship. "She is yours," Dr. Park said, his voice breaking on the second word. "There is no more doubt left in it. 99.99%. She is your daughter." Yeon-woo did not move for a long moment. The hallway around him blurred, sounds folding into each other, the beeping monitors down the corridor, a nurse's shoes against the floor, his own heartbeat suddenly louder than anything else in the building. "That is not possible," he whispered, though every part of him wanted it to be true, more than he had wanted anything in 7 years. "She died. I buried her. I stood over the grave myself." Dr. Park's face crumpled with something between grief and guilt. "I need to tell you something I should have told you the moment I first suspected it," he said. "The body we recovered 7 years ago was never properly examined the way it should have been. The water had done too much damage. I signed off on an identification that a heartbroken young father desperately needed to be true, and I never allowed myself to question it again after that day." Yeon-woo's legs nearly gave out beneath him. He reached for the wall to steady himself, his mind tearing backward through 7 years of grief built on top of a mistake he had never once suspected. "Then who?" he managed to ask. "Who did we bury?" "I do not know yet," Dr. Park admitted, "but I intend to find out. Whoever that child was, she deserves a name too. She deserves parents looking for her, the same way you never stopped looking for yours, even after you believed you had already found her." The investigation moved quickly once Dr. Park pulled every old file from that summer out of storage himself, cross-referencing missing persons reports from the surrounding coastal towns with the timeline of the accident. It did not take long to find her. A girl reported missing from a fishing village 3 towns south of where Yeon-woo's boat had gone down, last seen walking home from a market 2 days before the storm that swept Faith and her mother into the sea. Her family had assumed she ran away. Nobody had ever connected her disappearance to an accident that happened in a completely different stretch of coastline, because on paper there had never been any reason to. Her name was written carefully at the top of the old file, a girl no older than Faith had been at the time, taken and killed by someone who had never been caught, her small body eventually surfacing in the same tide that carried grief into Yeon-woo's life, exactly when he was too broken to look closely enough to notice the truth. Dr. Park sat with that file for a long time before closing it gently, promising himself he would personally see to it that her real family finally learned what had happened to her, even 7 years too late. Faith, meanwhile, had survived the storm in a way nobody had thought to search for. Carried by a current that pulled her far from where the search boats concentrated their efforts, she had washed up half-drowned on a stretch of beach, an entire day's drive from her mother's last known position. A fisherman named Cheol found her curled in the sand at dawn, barely breathing, unable to say a single word about who she belonged to. He had tried, in his own limited way, to find her family, asking around nearby villages for weeks, but a foreign-looking infant with no papers and no name attached to her raised more questions than the busy fishing town had patience to answer. Eventually, unable to care for a child himself, he left her at a shelter 2 towns over, and by the time anyone thought to connect a nameless baby found on a beach to a boating accident reported in the news that same week, months had already passed, and the connection nobody made in time became a gap that swallowed 7 years of Faith's life whole. She grew up moving between shelters that closed, foster placements that did not last, and eventually the streets themselves, never adopted, never claimed, carrying a face that looked nothing like the country around her, and a past that nobody bothered investigating closely enough to trace back to where it truly began. None of that history had a name attached to it until the night she walked into a restaurant and asked a grieving stranger for the food he was about to throw away. Yeon-woo did not tell Faith right away. He sat with the truth alone first, in the hospital chapel of all places, a room he had not entered once in 7 years of visiting this building for one appointment or another. He knelt there for a long time, saying nothing out loud, simply letting the weight of it move through him in silence. Grief and joy, tangled together so tightly he could not separate where one ended and the other began. When he finally returned to Faith's room, she was awake, sitting up against her pillows, watching cartoons on the small television mounted near the ceiling. "You look strange," she said, studying his face carefully. "Like something happened." Yeonwoo sat down slowly on the edge of her bed, taking both of her hands in his. "Something did happen," he said. "I need to tell you something important, and I need you to be brave while I say it." Faith's small face went serious immediately, her fingers tightening slightly around his. "Are you sending me away?" she asked, the fear in her voice older than her years, worn smooth from years of being told goodbye by people who did not want to keep her. "No," Yeonwoo said quickly, his voice cracking on the word. "No, Faith, I am never sending you away. I am telling you that I am not sending you away because I cannot. Because you are mine. You have always been mine, since before either of us knew it." Faith stared at him, confusion pulling her eyebrows together. "I do not understand. 7 years ago," Yeonwoo said slowly, forcing each word past the tightness in his throat, "I had a wife and a daughter, and we were on a boat when a storm came, and I lost them both in the water. I searched for 2 months. When a body was found, I was told it was my daughter, and I believed it, because I could not survive not believing it. But it was not you. You survived. You have been alive this entire time, and I never knew to keep looking, and I am so sorry. I am so sorry it took this long to find you." Faith did not speak for a long moment. Her eyes moved slowly over his face, searching for something, comparing it perhaps to a memory too faint to hold on to clearly, a woman's arms in dark water, a face she had never fully seen. "You are my father," she said finally, testing the words out loud, like they belonged to a language she was only now learning to speak. "Yes," Yeonwoo said, tears finally slipping past the careful control he had held onto for 7 straight years. "I am your father." Faith's face broke apart slowly, not into sadness, but into something too large for her small body to hold steady. Disbelief and grief and joy, arriving all at once with nowhere to go. She threw her arms around his neck, and Yeonwoo held her against his chest, both of them shaking, both of them finally allowing themselves to fall apart in front of each other without shame. "I asked you for your leftovers," Faith said into his shoulder, half laughing, half sobbing. "I asked my own father for his leftovers, and I did not even know it." "You did not need to know," Yeonwoo whispered against her hair. "I would have given you everything either way." Word of the swapped sample reached Ariam before Yeonwoo ever had the chance to confront her directly. Dr. Park, unwilling to let a hospital worker take the full blame for a scheme she had only been paid to carry out, traced the money back through careful, patient inquiry until it led, inevitably, to an account belonging to a company Ariam's family used for matters they preferred to keep quiet. Yeonwoo requested she come to the house that evening, and when she arrived, dressed as carefully as always, expecting perhaps another conversation about wedding preparations, she found him waiting in the study with a single folder placed on the desk between them. "Sit down," he said, his voice flat in a way she had never heard directed at her before. She sat, though her posture remained perfectly composed, a woman trained since childhood to never let her face give anything away. "A nurse named Hannah confessed everything this afternoon," Yeonwoo said, sliding the folder across the desk toward her. "The payment traces back to your family's holding company. I would like to hear you explain that, if there is anything left to explain." For the first time since Yeonwoo had known her, Ariam's composure slipped, just slightly, just enough for him to see the calculation happening rapidly behind her eyes as she searched for an angle that no longer existed. "I was protecting us," she said finally, her voice quieter than usual. "Protecting everything we were building. That girl was never meant to matter this much. I did what I thought was necessary." "You swapped a dying child's blood sample to protect a wedding," Yeonwoo said, his voice shaking now with something colder than anger. "You let me believe, even for a single day, that I had lost my daughter twice, because it was inconvenient for you to share a house with her." Ariam did not deny it. She simply sat very still, watching whatever remained of his patience for her disappear completely across the width of the desk between them. "The engagement is finished," Yeonwoo said. "You will leave this house tonight, and you will not contact my daughter again, in any way, for any reason." Aryam rose slowly, smoothing down her dress with hands that were, for the first time, not entirely steady. "You will regret choosing a stranger's child over everything we built together," she said at the door, her voice sharp with wounded pride rather than any real threat behind it. "She was never a stranger," Yeonwoo said quietly. "She was always mine. I simply did not know it yet." Aryam left without another word, and the sound of the front door closing behind her felt, to Yeonwoo, less like an ending and more like a window finally opening in a house that had been sealed shut for far too long. News of the broken engagement spread through certain circles faster than either family could control, though Yeonwoo found, surprisingly, that he did not care in the slightest what any of it cost him socially. He had spent 7 years building walls so careful and so complete that even he had forgotten there was a version of himself capable of caring about anything more than business and grief. Faith had walked through every one of those walls without even trying. Simply by being hungry and asking a stranger for kindness, he had almost forgotten he still had inside him. Faith came home from the hospital 11 days after she first collapsed in the school hallway, walking through the front door on her own 2 feet, Amara fussing over her the entire way up the steps, despite Dr. Park's clear medical approval for normal activity. The staff had strung small paper decorations across the hallway, nothing extravagant, simple colored strips Somi had helped design during a visit 2 days earlier, spelling out a welcome that needed no further explanation. "You did not have to do all this," Faith said, staring up at the decorations, her voice thick. "We did not do it because we had to," Amara said, squeezing her shoulder. "We did it because we wanted to." That evening, once the house had quieted and Faith had eaten more of Amara's cooking than any doctor probably recommended for someone recently discharged, Yeonwoo asked her to walk with him to the garden behind the house, where a single tall tree stood near the back wall, its branches heavy with early blossoms. "There is somewhere I want to take you tomorrow," he said, sitting down on the bench beneath the tree. "If you feel ready for it." "Where?" Faith asked, sitting beside him. "To see your mother," he said quietly. "Her grave. I have visited it alone for 7 years. I would like you to come with me now, if you want to." Faith considered this for a long moment, her small fingers tracing the wood grain of the bench beneath her. "Will it make you sad?" she asked. "It already makes me sad," Yeonwoo admitted. "But some sadness is worth carrying together instead of alone." The next morning, they drove out to a quiet hillside cemetery overlooking a stretch of coastline that Yeonwoo had specifically chosen all those years ago because it faced the sea without ever showing him the exact place where he had lost everything. Faith walked beside him in silence, holding a small bundle of white flowers Amara had cut from the garden that morning, until they reached a modest stone bearing a name Faith read slowly, sounding out each syllable like she was meeting her mother for the first time through language alone. "She looks like she was kind," Faith said, staring at the small photograph set into the stone. "She was," Yeonwoo said, his voice thick. "She would have loved you exactly as you are, hungry sweater choices and strange laughing observations included." Faith laughed softly through tears she had not noticed forming, kneeling down to place the flowers carefully at the base of the stone. "I am sorry it took me so long to find you," she whispered to the stone, her small voice steady despite everything trembling beneath it. "I did not know I was supposed to be looking too." Yeonwoo knelt beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, and for a long while neither of them said anything else at all, simply sitting together in the quiet, facing a sea that had once taken everything from him and had somehow, impossibly, years later, given part of it back. There was one more visit Yeonwoo insisted on making before the week ended, though he made it without Faith beside him this time. He drove alone to the small fishing town where Dr. Park's investigation had finally traced a grieving family who had spent 7 years wondering what happened to a daughter who vanished on her way home from a market. He did not have easy words prepared. He only had the truth and a promise that the search for whoever had taken her would not end simply because the case was old. The family's grief when he told them was its own kind of unbearable, a mirror held up to exactly what he had carried for 7 years himself. and he stayed with them longer than he had planned, offering whatever resources and support they needed to finally lay their daughter to rest under her own true name, instead of a silence that had swallowed her for far too long. He drove home that evening feeling both heavier and lighter than he had in years, carrying grief that was not entirely his own, alongside a joy that still felt too large and too fragile to fully believe. There was one name in Dr. Park's file that Yeon-woo could not stop thinking about, a fisherman called Chol, who had pulled a half-drowned infant out of the sand 7 years earlier and tried, in his own limited way, to find where she belonged before the world made that search impossible for him to finish. Yeon-woo drove out to the small coastal village alone one weekend, following an address Dr. Park had tracked down through old shelter records that had somehow survived 7 years of paperwork nobody thought would ever matter again. He found Chol mending a fishing net outside a small house near the harbor, an older man now, his hands rough and steady from decades of work on the water. Yeon-woo introduced himself carefully, explaining who he was and why he had come, and watched the old fisherman's face shift slowly from confusion into something closer to disbelief. "The baby girl," Chol said quietly, setting down his net. "I think of her sometimes. I always wondered what happened to her, whether she found somewhere good to grow up." "She did," Yeon-woo said, his voice thick. "Eventually. It took longer than it should have. But she did, and it is because of you that she had the chance to." Chol shook his head slowly, waving off the gratitude like it embarrassed him. "I did not do much. I only pulled her out of the water. The rest was not in my hands to give her." "You gave her the only thing that mattered that morning," Yeon-woo said. "You gave her more time. Everything else that followed only happened because she was still alive to receive it." The two men sat together for a long while after that, the old fisherman asking careful questions about the girl he had once carried through the surf as an infant, listening with visible relief as Yeon-woo described her laugh, her stubborn opinions about which sweater to wear, the way she thanked people too many times out of habit, built from years of expecting kindness to run out. Before Yeon-woo left, he pressed an envelope into Chol's hands, not as payment, he insisted, but as thanks that no amount of money could ever properly measure. Chol did not open the envelope until the car had already pulled away down the narrow coastal road, and when he finally did, he found not money at all, but an invitation, handwritten, asking him to come meet the girl himself whenever he felt ready, so she could finally thank the man who had refused to let the sea keep her. Chol arrived at the house 3 weeks later, standing awkwardly at the front gate, in a jacket that looked too formal for a man who spent most of his life in rubber boots and salt spray. Faith met him in the garden, uncertain at first how to greet a stranger who had once carried her, unconscious and unnamed, out of the surf that had taken her mother. "I do not remember you," she admitted honestly, standing a careful distance away. "I do not remember any of it. I only know what my father told me." "You were very small," Chol said gently. "There was nothing for you to remember yet. That is all right." Faith studied him for a long moment, then stepped forward and hugged him without warning, catching the old fisherman completely off guard. "Thank you for not letting the water win," she said, her voice muffled against his jacket. Chol stood very still for a moment, his eyes suddenly wet, before he finally hugged her back, careful, the way a man hugs something he once held far more gently than this, 7 years and an entire lifetime ago. He stayed for dinner that evening, and Amara made sure his plate stayed full the entire time, refilling it before he had even finished thanking her for the last serving, and by the time he left that night, promising to visit again whenever the fishing season allowed it, Faith had already decided that she wanted him to be part of her life for as long as he was willing to stay in it. Amara herself had her own history with loss, though she rarely spoke of it, and it was only on a quiet evening some weeks after Faith's homecoming that she finally shared a piece of it, sitting beside Faith on the kitchen floor while a pot of stew simmered slowly on the stove. "I had a daughter once," Amara said carefully, not looking up from the vegetables in her lap. "She would have been close to your age now, had things gone differently. I do not tell people this often. It is not a story I enjoy telling." Faith set down her own peeler, giving Amara her full and undivided attention. "What happened to her?" "She was sick," Amara said simply. There was nothing anyone could do, not the doctors, not the prayers, not anything I tried. I came to work in this house not long after, because staying in my old one with all her things still in place was more than I could carry. Is that why you were so kind to me? Faith asked quietly. Because of her. Amara finally looked up, her eyes soft. At first, perhaps, but it did not take long before I was kind to you, simply because you were you, Faith. Not because you filled a space she left behind. You built your own space here. Do not ever think you were only ever a replacement for someone else's absence. Faith reached over and took Amara's hand, and the two of them sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the stew bubbling gently on the stove, the kitchen warm with the kind of quiet understanding that did not need any more words to feel complete. Faith was waiting on the front steps when he arrived, swinging her legs against the stone, a notebook open on her lap where she had been practicing her full name over and over in careful, curling letters. Faith Kumelo Chang, she had written at the top of the page, testing how the new name felt beneath her fingers. Amara said I could choose whether to keep both names, she said, holding up the notebook as he climbed the steps toward her. I want to keep both. Kumelo, because that is who I was when nobody knew me. Chang, because that is who I am now, that somebody does. Yonwoo sat down beside her on the steps, reading the careful letters on the page, feeling something in his chest settle fully into place, for what felt like the first time in longer than he could measure. Both of those girls, he said softly, are the same brave one. Never forget that. Faith leaned her head against his shoulder, the evening light spreading gold and soft across the garden in front of them, the tree by the back wall shedding a few loose blossoms onto the grass below. I asked a stranger for his leftovers because I was hungry, she said quietly, almost to herself. I never imagined I was really just asking my father to finally come home to me. Faith returned to school 2 weeks later, once Dr. Park had cleared her fully and the last of the bruising on her arms had faded. News of who she truly was had already traveled ahead of her through parents talking over coffee and children repeating half-understood fragments in the hallways, and she braced herself that first morning for a version of the cruelty she had grown used to expecting, the kind that came from being different, being talked about, being turned into a story other people owned instead of one she got to tell herself. Somi met her at the school gate before she had even stepped out of the car, looping an arm through hers without hesitation. Everyone knows now, Somi said, walking her toward the entrance. I told them the true version before the wrong one could spread. About the restaurant, and the leftovers, and your father not caring what anyone in that place thought of you. You did not have to defend me, Faith said, though something in her chest loosened at the thought that someone had bothered to try at all. I wanted to, Somi said simply. That is what friends are for. The classroom that day treated her with a careful, curious kindness that felt strange after years of being overlooked entirely. Children asking gentle questions she did not mind answering. A teacher who made space for her without drawing unnecessary attention to the distance she had walked to get there. It was not perfect. A few whispers still followed her down certain hallways for weeks afterward. But it was enough. And enough, Faith was slowly learning, could be its own kind of miracle when a person had spent most of her life with nothing at all. Somewhere in the kitchen behind them, Amara had already begun preparing dinner for 3 instead of 2, humming a tune under her breath that carried faintly out into the garden, and further down the hallway, framed on the wall beside an old photograph of a laughing woman and her infant daughter. A new photograph had already been hung that same afternoon. A tired man and a formerly homeless girl standing together outside a modest restaurant, both of them smiling at a camera neither of them had expected their lives to ever include again. The story that traveled quietly through the city in the weeks that followed was never really about wealth changing hands, or about a powerful man's broken engagement, or even about a mystery finally solved after 7 long years. It became, in the retelling that mattered most, a simple lesson passed from one person to another, the way important lessons always are, quietly, without asking for credit. A hungry child had once asked a stranger for food he did not need, expecting nothing more than scraps, and perhaps a moment of mercy, before being turned away like every other door that had closed on her before. She had not known his name, she had not known his grief. She had certainly never imagined that the ache behind his eyes was already, somehow, recognizing something in her own face that neither of them yet understood. He had given her a seat at his table without asking what she could offer him in return, and in doing so, without either of them realizing it in that first strange, quiet moment. He had already begun finding his way back to a daughter the sea had never actually taken from him at all. Kindness, offered freely and without condition, had opened a door that grief alone could never have found on its own. And on quiet evenings, long after the story had settled into the ordinary rhythm of a family finally whole again, Faith would sometimes stand by that same tree in the garden, tracing the bark with her fingers, thinking about every door that had ever closed on her before this one finally opened, and she would remind herself, gently, the way Amara had once taught her, that some things really do last longer than you think. Not everything good disappears. Some months later, on an ordinary evening that carried none of the weight of everything that had come before it, Faith sat at the kitchen table finishing homework, while Amara hummed over the stove and Yeon-woo read through papers at the far end of the table, glancing up every few minutes, just to watch her chew the end of her pencil in concentration. "I have a question," Faith said, not looking up from her notebook, her pencil pausing mid-word as if the question had been sitting quietly in her chest for longer than she wanted to admit. "Ask it," Yeon-woo said, setting his pen down completely. "Do you think she would like who I turned out to be?" Faith asked quietly. "My mother, even though she never got to see it." Yeon-woo set down his papers entirely, giving her the full weight of his attention. "She would be proud of every part of you," he said. "The hungry part that asked for what she needed without shame, and the brave part that kept surviving long after most people would have stopped trying, and the quiet, patient part, sitting right here, right now, worried about a question that only proves how much you already carry her kindness inside you, whether you remember her face or not." Faith smiled down at her notebook, something settled and steady finally taking root behind her eyes, the kind of quiet certainty that takes most people years to build, and that she had only just begun to trust as real instead of temporary. And outside the kitchen window, the last of the evening light spread gold across a garden that had, slowly and without ever announcing it, become the truest home she had ever known, a home that had started, impossibly, with nothing more than a plate of leftovers and a stranger who chose kindness when he had every easy reason not to.